Hi everyone, this is Josh Lippert. I'm going to call on Donnell to just make sure everyone can see and hear me. Donnell, just want to confirm that you can see and hear me before we get started. Great, awesome. Thanks so much for confirming that, Donnell. I wanted to thank you for coming today to the webinar brought to you by the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission, the Water Resources Center. I'm Josh Lippert, and I will be your host and presenter today. I'm the Floodplain Manager for the City of Philadelphia and the Vice Chair of the Pennsylvania Floodplain Managers Association. And I'm formerly born and raised in Pittsburgh, PA. Grew up in the floodplain of French Creek in northwestern PA, and was formerly the floodplain manager and stormwater coordinator with the city of Pittsburgh. So when I was looking at the attendees today, I saw many familiar names, and I only wish we could be in person to see everyone's faces today. And when Aaron and I from SPC started to plan this almost a year ago, we wanted to have this this past spring in person, but unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we are here today presenting to you the Floodplain Management 101 webinar. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We will be looking at that at the end of today's presentation. This presentation today will also be recorded, and it'll be up on SPC's Water Resources Center's website. And if you can't wait for that, it's also up on the Pennsylvania Floodplain Managers Association website immediately after today's presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll also call on anyone that has their hands raised if you want to ask your question through audio versus through typing in the chat box. Excuse me. So today's presentation is a 1-hour fun-filled Floodplain Management 101 course. It's a course that I've developed over the last several years, and I've used to train over 3,500 design professionals and floodplain managers here in Philadelphia and across the state. And I believe today we had about 80 individuals sign up today for today's event. So welcome everyone to today's presentation. Just a little disclaimer about this training. Everything that you'll see today is advisory. Always review your local codes and regulations if you are doing any sort of permitting or design in floodplains. Everything I'll show you today is guidance. They're best practices and resources, and they're not necessarily adopted codes and regulation. So again, always refer back to those locally adopted regulations. In terms of the codes and regulations that I'll talk about today, they are generally based on the Pennsylvania Model Ordinance dated April 2016, with a lot of incorporation from the building codes, specifically the 2018 codes, and even more specifically Appendix G and ASE 24. Just to give you an idea of what today's presentation will encompass. I always like to start off with the types of flooding in Pennsylvania. These show what happens across the state. We all have riverine flooding. We also have dam and levees throughout the state that could potentially fail and cause flooding events. We're seeing increased rainfall throughout the Commonwealth that are attributing not only flooding, but also landslide conditions, among many others. And then one of the most devastating flooding events that occurs throughout Pennsylvania is the effects of hurricanes and tropical storms, most commonly some of the disasters that have been declared here in the Commonwealth. And then there are very localized flooding, urban and infrastructure flooding, specifically in our densely populated urban areas, when sewers become overcapacitated and streets become like rivers, and manholes can even pop like geysers in this photo. Up in northwestern PA, we have lakefront flooding, Lake Erie. We also, on the east coast or the east side of Pennsylvania, have the threat of tidal flooding as well as sea level rise. This image showing Philadelphia International Airport slated to be totally inundated by year 2100. So this just gives you a sense of all the different types of flooding. But for today's presentation, we'll focus specifically on this typical cross-section, typically of a riverine flood condition. And we're going to be talking a lot about the special flood hazard area, which is encompassed in this cross-section, specifically known as the 1% annual chance flood event, and formerly known as the 100-year flood event. But 1% chance is the new common language there. Within this cross-section, you'll see the floodway, which is typically the stream channel, and then on either side being the flood fringe, where predominantly where development is occurring today in the Commonwealth, with maybe some minimal development in the floodway. So every time I talk about floodplain management, special flood hazard area, we'll be talking about this cross-section for today's presentation. I like to start off with some of the rules and responsibilities, specifically the role of a floodplain administrator or a floodplain manager. It may even be the zoning administrator or building code official, depending on your local jurisdiction. But make sure you know who is responsible for administrating the floodplain regulations. And that administrator has to do everything that you see here, adopt compliant codes and regulation, permit development, conduct training, do auditing, as well as coordination with state and federal partners. It's also important to realize that there might be others involved with floodplain permitting, and even specifically plans examiners. So although the floodplain administrator might be located in the zoning department or just a floodplain manager separate from zoning, the building code examiners and zoning plans examiners might have a huge role in making sure that floodplain management regulations are enforced. And even the building inspectors, not only during permitting, but during construction, there are key roles for the building inspectors to make sure they are meeting what was designed and approved at the permit step. And then finally, design professionals play a vital role in all floodplain management. They also tend to give me the biggest headache in floodplain management. Specifically land surveyors, architects, landscape architects, and engineers. Many varieties of engineers are involved in designs in the floodplain. So making sure that these design professionals are aware and educated and are designing compliant development in floodplains is extremely important. And then not to forget the urban planners. Planners play a vital role in land use decisions as well as long-range plans. So really identifying where those maybe no build or limited build areas are in our floodplains. Okay, so today's fun-filled floodplain management training will encompass things related to the National Flood Insurance Program. We'll dive a little deeper into flood hazard information, specifically FEMA maps. We'll focus heavily on regulations. Really like to dive deep there. We'll talk a little bit about elevation certificates. We'll follow that up by letters of map revision or map change. And then I'll provide you a host of resources. And again, this presentation will be available both recorded as well as a PDF. And the PDF has hyperlinks to a lot of the information. So there's gonna be a lot of information today. So to start off, the National Flood Insurance Program has three main components. It has risk identification, which is through the mapping, management through the regulations, and then finally insurance. And insurance being the most prevalent because 1 inch of floodwaters can cause upwards of $20,000 worth of damage in the structure. The program was created in 1968 because there wasn't the availability of flood insurance on the private insurance market. In Pennsylvania, every jurisdiction, every borough, township, etc., is mandatorily required to adopt floodplain management regulations through Pennsylvania Act 166. So they have to adopt and enforce the minimally compliant state regulations. The key benefits to this in Pennsylvania is that we can offer all of our residents throughout the Commonwealth flood insurance, no matter if you're at the top of the hill, the bottom of the hill, in the floodplain, outside the floodplain. Anyone in Pennsylvania can get flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program as a participating locality. You also can get grants and loans. So if there was a disaster, you can get disaster assistance, but you can get grants and loans in terms of mitigation projects. And then finally, if you're located in the special flood hazard area, that 1% annual chance flood event area, you are mandatorily required to have flood insurance if you have a mortgage or a federally backed loan against that property. So it's vitally important for those properties to be bought and sold in Pennsylvania to have the availability of flood insurance. With the one caveat that today in Pennsylvania, there is the availability of private flood insurance, but that could go away tomorrow, much like the wildfire insurance in California that we're seeing. But there also is the national flood insurance that's also available here in Pennsylvania. Flood insurance is important because it can range widely in terms of how much it costs per year for individual single family homes. If your home is elevated or if you're outside of the special flood hazard area, you can pay just a few $100s a year, shown on the right side of this image. Whereas if you are in the special flood hazard area and you have below grade spaces, you can pay thousands of dollars a year. Both in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia, I know of single family homes, about 2,000, 3,000 square feet, that we're paying between $3,000 and $5,000 a year in the special flood hazard area. And then this just gets into a little bit deeper, specifically here in Philadelphia, the policies versus the repetitive loss. I'll first start with the policies on the right. Here in the city of Philadelphia, we have about 4,200 participants of the National Flood Insurance Program. And this image shows it by zip code, those big blue, green dots. And on the left shows the properties that have been paid out multiple times through the National Flood Insurance Program. And this is important because if we were in person, I would ask you, what does this red dot map show you? Being that the dark blue areas are the special flood hazard area. So I'll pause for a second. The key thing that this shows is there are a lot of flooding events occurring well outside of those special flood hazard areas. In the middle of Philadelphia on Broad Street, a couple miles from a special flood hazard area, there's been flooding events. These individuals had National Flood Insurance Program and paid out multiple times. And this is also important because it's where you can identify where you need to make investments into flood mitigation. So some of the bigger red dots on the left side, those are dots that represent $1.5 million worth of payouts for one individual property. So this information can be vitally important and can be accessed from FEMA through a special request. Getting back to the National Flood Insurance Program now, there are federal, state, and local responsibilities. The federal level, they have the program oversight, FEMA Region 3 specifically for Pennsylvania, as well as all the surrounding states. They provide the risk mapping, they establish the development and building standards in general, and they also provide the insurance coverage. At the state level, we have an NFIP program manager, Bill Bradfield, and the state can help with oversight as well. They can be your first stop before you go to the FEMA Region 3 for any questions or technical assistance. And they also provide that minimum state model ordinance. So those minimum standards that each jurisdiction within Pennsylvania must adopt. And then the bulk of the responsibilities being on our local jurisdictions, which, as you can imagine, is very complicated in Pennsylvania. We have over 2,500 jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction should have an identified floodplain manager. They should have adopted compliant regulations, and they should be issuing development permits on any type of development in the special flood hazard area, which can prove extremely challenging, especially in Pennsylvania, where we have some volunteer staff at some of our jurisdictions. Also making substantial damage determinations, which we'll get into, and overseeing all of development, whether it's a standalone floodplain ordinance, if it's your zoning code or building code, or all three. And this is important because every 5 years, FEMA can do what they call a community assistance visit. This is their fuzzy word for an audit. I know that Pittsburgh had theirs in 2014 when I was a floodplain manager. Philadelphia had theirs in 2016. These visits or audits show all of the non-compliance issues related to development in floodplains. Not only does FEMA Region 3 do an exhaustive review of permit documentation, but they also do floodplain tours in your jurisdiction. And in both cases, in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, we had hundreds of violations. These violations could cause the municipality to be put on probation, probation being a $50 surcharge for all policyholders within that jurisdiction until that jurisdiction becomes compliant again in an NFIP. And then the worst case scenario, which has happened in Pennsylvania, is full suspension from the National Flood Insurance Program. So if you haven't adopted a compliant ordinance, if you are not remedying the issues on those community assistance visits, then you are no longer eligible as a municipality in the National Flood Insurance Program, meaning no more federally backed mortgages or loans unless you go private flood insurance, no more disaster assistance if a flood event would impact your area, etc. Okay, so now we're going to get into flood hazard mapping. So how many people out there have seen a FEMA flood map or have visited the FEMA Flood Map Service Center? So I hope a lot of people are in their house and they're saying yes. So this is what the Flood Map Service Center looks like. It's much like Google. You just type in an address and an interactive map shows up at the bottom. And we're lucky enough here in Pennsylvania to almost have, I think, the entire state covered by digital maps, which is really unique for the country. So when you go to this Flood Map Service Center, type in an address. If you click the magnifying glass with a little paper, it'll actually print you an 8.5 by 11 exhibit. This exhibit gives you everything you need to know in general about your property, whether it's in the special flood hazard area or outside. So this specific map shows a riverine condition here in Philadelphia. You'll see the river flowing through the middle of the map with a hatch line. That hatch line represents that floodway, going back to that cross section a little bit earlier. On either side of that floodway is the blue shaded area. That is the flood fringe. So together, that hatched area as well as the blue area represents the special flood hazard area, or the 1% annual chance floodplain. On either side of that, in general, is the orange area, known as the 0.2% chance floodplain, formerly known as the 500-year floodplain. And then anywhere else on the map that is unshaded are minimal areas of flood hazard. Some other key things to identify on flood maps is that there are black lines that transect these floodplains. Those represent cross sections, which can be found in your flood insurance study, the FIS. Those help you identify the base flood elevation, that elevation of that 1% annual chance flood, to the nearest 10th decimal. So I'll show that here. So this is what an illustrative image of what a flood insurance study looks like, specifically a cross section. So when you see those black lines, you open up the flood insurance study, also found on the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. You can identify to the nearest 10th decimal the base flood elevation for any individual parcel or property located in the special flood hazard area. We also have coastal conditions here in Pennsylvania, specifically on the eastern side. These maps are a little bit more unique because they do not have a floodway identified. So this is the Delaware River, where it does not have an identified floodway, but it does have a LINWA line, a limit to moderate wave action line. That's that black line with triangles shown on this map. That identifies that there can be wave action. So we have tidal influence here on the Delaware. We also can have storm surge if a hurricane were to come up the Delaware River, causing that wave action to occur, thus that limit to moderate wave action line. Some other key things about the Flood Map Service Center, you can go to the tab that says Show All Products in the middle of the screen. That tab will actually bring up all of the effective maps, the maps that you regulate off of, but also all the historical maps. So you can go back through time. For instance, here in Philadelphia, we've had about 4 map updates since 1978. So you can look back historically how the flood maps have changed for individual properties or citywide. So that's some other key information on the Flood Map Service Center. And for those that have seen the historic maps, they used to be printed before they became digital, and they were black and white, like is shown here on the screen. So instead of being blue and red hatch and orange, they were just black and white as shown here. Another key thing for all those floodplain administrators out there today, you can actually sign up for notifications to get emails for when there is any sort of product change in your local jurisdiction. So it's really important, if you are that floodplain administrator, to really keep track of all the changes that are happening to your flood insurance rate maps. You can do that on the Flood Map Service Center. Okay, so now we're going to get into the regulations. This is my sweet spot in terms of floodplain management. And it's also some of the most challenging. And it depends on where you're located. Again, like the disclaimer said, your floodplain management regulations can be your standalone regulations. They can be in your zoning ordinances. They can be in your subdivision regulations. They can be in your building codes. They could be in your stormwater codes. They could be in your health codes, or all of the above. So it's really important to understand where the floodplain regulations come from in your locally adopted regulations. There also can be a variety of sources. So you have the PA model ordinance, which is shown here, but you also have all the building codes. So you have the IBC, the IRC, Appendix G, and then you also might have adopted ASE 24 as well as ASE 7, ASE 7 being the flood loading or structural design criteria located in floodplains. And how this all works together is that there are the federal 44 CFR NFIP regulations. Those flow down to those state model ordinances or those building codes And the building codes can feed off of that as well. And there's other American Society of Civil Engineer codes, like I stated earlier, that ASE 7 and ASE 24 that can feed into this as well. But one thing to note is that there are a lot of conflicts. So if you are regulating with building codes and zoning codes and model ordinances, make sure you know the wording differences and the differences in requirements. It's vitally important for floodplain administrators and for design professionals. It's also important to understand the approach. So you could have the standalone building code approach in your jurisdiction. You could have a comprehensive approach, which is everything that I stated before: zoning, building, subdivision, health codes, stormwater codes. Or you might even have a standalone floodplain regulation or ordinance with the addition of building code. So you can have any of these or all of the above within your jurisdiction. One of the benefits for regulating off of the international building codes is that for every dollar spent to become floodplain compliant with those I codes, you are saving $6 in mitigation costs. So I codes can be extremely beneficial to take your model ordinance or your zoning code and really take that to the next level for building resiliency in floodplains. But you also have to make sure that the building codes are very specific to buildings. So there are some loopholes when you only use building codes. Okay, so I like to start off with the definition of development before we dive deeper into very specific design challenges in floodplains. I like to bring up this definition because it's more than just traditional definitions of development. It goes beyond just new construction, renovation, alterations, additions. Floodplain development is all encompassing. Any man-made change is considered development in floodplains. Even temporary storage and structures, or even temporary or permanent storage of materials. So log piles or mulch piles, those are technically development when located in floodplains and must be regulated. It's also important to know some key dates. Every jurisdiction has these dates, whether you're pre-firm or post-firm. So pre-firm are structures that were built before your local jurisdictions had floodplain maps and floodplain regulations. So these are structures that were built before there were requirements to build elevated or dry flood proof, etc. So those are pre-firm structures. Anything built in your jurisdictions in floodplains after adopted regulations or maps are called post-firm structures. Those structures were built to some sort of floodplain regulation, and they must maintain that compliance in perpetuity. What this means is typically pre-firm structures in Pennsylvania are structures with basements, and post-firm structures are slab on grade or elevated structures. And if you've been to the Jersey Shore or any of the shores, houses that are built on grade at the shore versus elevated are pre-firm versus post-firm. It's important to note that there are specifically prohibited and restricted uses in floodplains. Prohibited uses like hospitals, group living, housing for the elderly, senior housing, detention and correctional facilities, manufactured home parks are prohibited in the special flood hazard area per the state model ordinance. There's also restrictions and prohibitions on dangerous development, specifically the storage or production of all of these hazardous materials in the special flood hazard area. Subdivisions are also regulated, so anything over 50 lots or 5 acres, whichever is lesser, must be regulated in the special flood hazard area. One key definition that is in conflict is the definition of residential versus non-residential. I like to pull up this slide because typically definitions of residential are single family or multifamily homes. However, in ASE 24, that's the American Society of Civil Engineers, that their definition of residential is everything where there are sleeping occurring. So condominiums, multifamily dwellings, apartments, lodging houses, hotels, and motels are considered residential structures. Anything not in that definition is then considered non-residential. And then they go a step further. There are non-residential structures that are critical or essential facilities. So things like our EMS, fire, police, and some aviation facilities are considered critical or essential. And they actually have a higher requirement in terms of development in the special flood hazard area, in this case being 24 inches above that base flood elevation. One of the most prevalent building permits that you'll receive as any sort of floodplain manager is for existing structures. With one of the most challenging parts of floodplain management being the definition of substantial improvement. Substantial improvement is when you renovate or rehabilitate or add an addition to a structure that is more than 50% of the market value of the existing structure, then that structure is deemed substantially improved or a substantial improvement, meaning it must become compliant with the adopted codes and regulations of today. So whether it's a pre-firm structure or a post-firm structure, as soon as you exceed that 50%, the structure must be compliant of the regulations of today. The reason this is one of the most challenging concepts in floodplain management is establishing the value of the structure as well as establishing the value of work. So a number on a building permit is not acceptable when making substantial improvement definitions. You must have a detailed cost estimate associated with that permit, whether it's a zoning permit, building permit, or floodplain permit associated with that application to have the documentation. The documentation for substantial improvement must include all materials, labor, profit, and overhead, anything that's physically built into the structure, built-in appliances, built-in cabinetry, all finishes must be included in that detailed cost estimate. And then you must establish the market value. And the market value is referring to the value of the structure minus the land, making it even more complicated. Luckily, I know both in Allegheny County as well as Philadelphia County, we have amazing either tax assessment websites or property assessment websites where they actually break out the building and the land. So to make this substantial determination, you always factor that against the structure only value and 50% of that value, which triggers substantial improvement. Okay, getting into floodway development. Floodway development almost always requires a no-rise certificate, which is typically supplemented through an H&H study. And there's also always federal and state permits that also apply, typically because the floodway is the channel of the stream in most cases. So these are the main requirements here. In some jurisdictions, they allow floodway development. In some jurisdictions do not. So just make sure you're looking if whether you're minimally compliant or if you have higher standards adopted in the floodway, because these are the most hazardous areas for construction in the special flood hazard area. It's also important that alterations, relocations of watercourses do require a lot more permitting. They require the state and federal permits, so DEP and Army Corps to name a few, but they also must require the no-rise study, and in some cases, they will require a FEMA letter of map change, which we'll talk about later. And this is everything from stream restoration projects or floodplain restoration projects will require everything that you see here on this slide. A-zones, these are extremely difficult zones to regulate development, and they occur all over the state of Pennsylvania. These zones are called A-zones because they are approximate zones in terms of FEMA regulations. Approximate zones meaning FEMA did not have enough technical data to map a base flood elevation associated with these zones. So they're just identified as flood hazard areas, but did not have enough technical data to actually establish that base flood elevation. So in almost all cases, any sort of new development in these A-zones does require significant engineering study and analysis, which could be more costly for the applicant. And the applicant or the jurisdiction should always reach out to FEMA to get the data that they had to develop these A-zones as a starting off point for any sort of H&H or engineering analysis that occurs. Diving a little bit deeper into solely residential construction, residential construction must be elevated base flood elevation plus 18 inches here in Pennsylvania. So that is all living spaces. So living rooms, offices, bedrooms, rec rooms must be elevated 18 inches above the base flood elevation. In residential construction, you cannot have below grade spaces. So below grade on 4 sides is prohibited. However, you can have spaces that are enclosed below that BFE plus 18 inches, as long as it's used solely for parking, building access, and storage, incidental storage. If you do have those spaces, they must allow floodwaters to automatically enter and exit those enclosure spaces, typically through the use of flood vents, which I'll show you on a few more slides. It's also important that in the age of Uber and autonomous vehicles, that you can never convert these parking, building access, or storage areas into livable space. So no offices, guest bedrooms, or rec rooms, or bathrooms can be converted in these livable spaces. And in some cases, you may require a non-conversion clause on your building permit. They also need to be designed with flood damage resistant materials, which we'll get into a little bit later. So this is a structure, an image with an enclosure area. In this case, is a crawl space. So there's nothing below grade, but the structure is elevated on a foundation wall, 18 inches above the base elevation, that's lowest floor. Below that, they have a crawl space. That crawl space, because it's fully enclosed, must allow the automatic entry and exit of floodwaters to reduce the hydrostatic and hydrodynamic loads on those foundation walls, so it doesn't collapse or become damaged in a flood event. So in this image, you'll see flood vents. For flood vents, they need to be on at least two sides of the structure to allow that automatic entry and exit of floodwaters. They can be no higher than 12 inches from grade, and they must be 1 square inch of flood vent for every square foot of enclosure space. So again, 1 square inch of flood vent for every square foot of enclosure space, no higher than 12 inches, and at least on two sides of the structure. And in general, they only count when they're below that base flood elevation. Throughout the state, we have a lot of townhome developments, which can pose some even more challenges with flood vents. Townhomes, even the middle home, does require flood vents on two sides of the structure. So they must be on the front and the back of the structure, as well as in any walls in between those spaces. So in the middle here, we see a storage room and a garage. There has to be flood vents between those two spaces in order for the floodwaters to automatically go through the structure. It's another cross section, again, a house that's elevated 18 inches above, or in this case, 12 inches above the base elevation, which was the minimum federal standard, but in Pennsylvania, 18 inches above is the minimum standard. But here again, you see the flood vent no more than 12 inches above that exterior grade. I can't tell you how many times I've seen flood vents installed 18 or 24 inches above adjacent grade, which can cause those foundation issues. And we'll talk about elevation certificates later, but on A8 and A9 of elevation certificates, you actually identify the flood venting that is installed or designed to be installed in structures. Getting back to flood damage resistant materials. So when you do have that automatic entry and exit of floodwaters in structures, these parts of the structures must be designed with systems that can have direct and prolonged contact with floodwaters of up to 72 hours. There's a great table in the flood damage resistant materials FEMA technical bulletin that identifies things like bad insulation is prohibited, but rigid or foam insulation is allowed, as well as masonry materials or metal materials versus wood materials in these flood damage resistant material areas. When we talk about non-residential structures, you have two options in general, unless you've adopted higher standards. The one option is just like residential, you elevate everything 18 inches above that base flood elevation, with the caveat that you can have parking, building access, incidental storage below. Or you could actually design the structure to be dry flood proof. So if it is non-residential, you can have spaces below that BFE plus 18 inches, but you make sure that water will not enter the structure in the event of a flood, which can be challenging and costly. The Army Corps suggests that you only do it up to 3 feet. And typically we see these types of flood vents installed. They're usually manual interventions because the automatic ones cost 4 to 6 times more expensive than the manual interventions. But these are gates that go across doors and windows or any sort of opening on the exterior of the structure. It's also vitally important that you do a lot of structural loading criteria because remember, instead of the equalization of those flood loads, you're gonna have all those flood loads on the foundation walls. So that's why the Army Corps suggests trying to do this only up to 3 feet. But again, I've personally seen it done up to 8 to 10 feet on structures. Another consideration is mixed use structures. So in some of the more urban areas throughout the Commonwealth, we have a lot of mixed use structures being constructed in floodplains. And these pose even more challenges. And you have to think of them almost as 2 separate structures. All of the residential portions of the structure must be elevated 18 inches above the base elevation, whereas those non-residential portions, the CVS, the Rite Aid, the restaurant, those can be below that BFE plus 18 inches, but they must be designed to be dry flood proofed. And one important factor here is lobbies with desk attendants, furniture, mailboxes, trash receptacles, gyms, amenity spaces. Those are considered residential portions and they must be elevated 18 inches above the base flood elevation. With the caveat that if the residential and the commercial share one lobby, that lobby is allowed to be dry flood proofed per FEMA technical bulletins, which I have that resource at the very end of our presentation. Another requirement is the dry flood proofing certificate. This also can be extremely problematic. My time in Pittsburgh, an architect and engineer fought for 6 months about completing the FEMA dry flood proofing certificate. These are challenging because they come at the very end of a project. So the design professional might submit the building permits and then step away from a project. But at the very end of the project, before you get their certificate of occupancy, that design professional, whether it's the architect or engineer, must come out to the structure and certify that the structure was built to be dry flood proof, not just designed to be dry flood proof. So it's extremely important. Some of the other important factors on this is that you must produce a flood emergency operations plan, which includes things like dealing with seepage or leakage, so sump pumps or backflow preventers. But the plan should be the chain of command, how you get notified of a flood event, what personnel has duties to get those floodgates out of the storage, putting those in their tracks, how you maintain the floodgates. They often have gaskets that can dry rot and deteriorate, so making sure that there's maintenance incorporated into this plan. And even thinking about doing a flood drill, like a fire drill every year, or at least once a year they install these floodgates to keep up the practice. Below grade parking is only allowed below non-residential structures, and below grade parking must be dry flood proof to that BFE plus 18 inches. This is an image of a parking garage in Houston, Texas. It has automatic gates that come up at pedestrian doors as well as vehicular doors on this structure. Machinery and equipment, my general rule and the way the regulations work is that if it cannot be inundated by floodwaters, it must be elevated 18 inches above the base flood elevation, and wherever it's elevated on must be anchored or secured so it doesn't become buoyant or float around in a flood event. So things like AC units, they must be elevated and anchored so they don't break away or become buoyant. With the one caveat that if you do have plumbing fixtures, like in this bottom right image, that plumbing fixture might be significantly sound to be inundated by floodwaters, but it might have electronical components to open and close valves. And those are the components that are not able to be submerged in floodwaters. So just making sure that those are designed correctly. This just shows inside of a structure that is wet flood proof, they have a plinth, a masonry plinth that elevates the hot water tank and HVAC in this instance. It's also one of my pro tips that you must look at the accessory structures in development, specifically fuel tanks, AC units, transformer pads, or generators. Those are sometimes outside of the building envelope. And those too must be elevated 18 inches above the base flood elevation. And those are extremely important because a transformer pad, the main reason why residents or occupants can't re-enter a building after a flood event is because of the electrical components are out of service. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the transformer pads just adjacent to the structure being well below that base flood elevation. So just make sure that you're looking at all of those accessory structures. Elevators have 3 main requirements. Elevators that have a pit that goes below that base flood elevation plus 18 inches must have 3 things. They must have their mechanicals elevated 18 inches above the base flood elevation. They must be programmed so that the cab of the elevator always rests on that floor above BFE plus 18 inches. So if you have a garage space that gets wet flood proofed, that cab should always rest on the floor above that garage space. And then finally, it should have a float switch so that that cab never enters an inundated pit in an elevator shaft. Sanitary systems, whether it's municipal sanitary systems or on-site systems, should not allow the infiltration of floodwaters. And if it's on-site disposal systems, they should almost always be located outside of the special flood hazard area. But there are some exceptions, but you still have to meet the state and federal regulations. Streets, believe it or not, are found in our PA floodplain model ordinance. Streets must not be more than 1 foot below the regulatory flood elevation. So what that means, the regulatory flood elevation in our state model ordinance being BFE plus 18 inches. So streets must not be more than 6 inches, BFE plus 6 inches in Pennsylvania. Accessory structures are as vitally important as those other ones I talked about, like the transformer pads, things like shed structures. This shed, to be compliant, must only be used for incidental storage. It must be anchored so that it doesn't become buoyant and damage downstream bridges, buildings, etc. It also must have its mechanicals, if included, elevated 18 inches above that base flood elevation. Recreational vehicles and trailers are also regulated. So again, that definition of development is expansive in floodplain management. Recreational vehicles and trailers must remain on a site fewer than 180 consecutive days and be fully licensed and road ready, or they have to be anchored and elevated like permanent construction. Believe it or not, even temporary tent structures like shown here in this image are regulated. During the CAV in Pittsburgh, outside of Heinz Field, FEMA actually flagged these types of tents as being non-compliant because the city did not have permitting documentation associated with these types of structures. So in general, if they're not enclosed, like the one here, it needs to be anchored so that it doesn't become buoyant. And if it is enclosed, it must have flood vents and be anchored as well. Storage is also of concern. Here in Philadelphia, we unfortunately have a lot of junkyards along the Delaware River located in the floodplain. For instance, for a junkyard to be compliant, each one of these cars must not have any sort of hazardous materials, first of all, but each one must be anchored or elevated in order to be compliant, or anchored and elevated, depending on the anchoring system you're using. But that goes also for log piles, mulch piles. That is considered storage in a floodplain and must be anchored or elevated to meet the requirements. Whereas temporary furniture, like shown here, as long as it can be moved, my general rule is without equipment by an individual person, then it would just be removed in the event of a flood. We also, during our CAV here in Philadelphia, had a lot of building going on, specifically construction trailers. Construction trailers, or any type of trailer like this, would need to be compliant, much like the recreational vehicles, on site less than 180 days. This one in particular, because it's up on blocks, would need to be anchored and elevated to become compliant, or anchored and dry flood proofed, which dry flood proofing may prove to be challenging. The placement of fill is equally important. Fill can fill in a bathtub and cause adjacent properties to flood. So there are some requirements, typically geotech reports, and potentially a letter of map change for the placement of fill in the floodplain. And then finally, historic structures. Historic structures are one of the few structures that can more easily receive a variance, and I'll talk about variances in a second. But specifically, historic structures, if by filling in windows or doors or having to physically elevate that historic structure, if it is going to require it to be removed from its historic designation, you can receive a variance for those code compliant items. However, other items like mechanicals and flood damage resistant materials should be incorporated into the design to reduce the flood risk as much as possible. Because although you are getting a sort of variance here, there still is tremendous flood risk for historic structures located in the floodplain. This structure actually has all of its mechanicals peeping up off the roof of the structure. So variances. This is the final slide of this regulations section. Variances are interesting in floodplain management because there are special conditions for both the applicant as well as the city or the municipality when it comes to issuing variances in floodplains. So please review your zoning code, the state model ordinance, or your building codes, because there are specific variance conditions in all of those different code applications. Okay, so elevation certificates. How many people out there have seen elevation certificates, filled out them? How many people have seen complete or correct ones in their time? I jokingly say that because as a floodplain manager, I've reviewed hundreds of elevation certificates, and I would say 99% of the time, that makes me want to pull my hair out because they are non-compliant, or they're not completed correctly, or they're inconsistent, or they're not even completely filled out. So make sure that you read the instructions, you confirm that it's the compliant edition, and then in some cases requiring it 3 times during development. This is the best practice, requiring it for when you submit plans to the city for its permitting. You do it again for when the lowest floor is installed during construction, and then when construction is substantially complete. In general, all the lines must be completed on elevation certificates. And when they don't need to be completed, you should put an NA. They also should be completed by a licensed surveyor, architect, or engineer. And the base elevation should always be in the correct vertical datum associated with the FEMA flood insurance rate map, or rounded to the nearest 10th degree, with no whole numbers used. So again, using those cross sections and identifying the base elevation to the nearest 10th decimal point. It's also important to identify all of the specific design elevations. So the lowest floor, the next highest floor, which are all found in section C of the elevation certificate, is extremely important. Believe it or not, I've seen these plus or minus in front of them, or completed totally blank. Specifically with C2E, identifying the lowest machinery or equipment is important. Okay. And the last part I wanted to talk about was letters of map change. Try to do a time check here. I want to leave some time for questions. Letters of map revision or letters of map change are extremely important because they can be caused by updated data, whether it's new LIDAR, new flood studies. FEMA tends to do map updates in Pennsylvania plus or minus every 15 years is my general rule, although they should be doing it every 5 years. But they also do these for reflecting physical changes or flood control. So when new culverts, new bridges, new roadways, piers or wharfs, new dams, or even when fill has been placed, those can cause physical changes to the flood insurance rate maps. So those are some of the important reasons to do letters of map revision. And these are specifically an application to FEMA with some community input on that application. So when I talk about letters of map change, I talk about a variety of different options. Specifically these two, there's the MT1 and the MT2. MT1 has a whole host of different varieties, I call it. And then MT2 being a little bit more challenging and a little less in terms of its offerings. So those are the LOMARs and CLOMARs as part of the MT2. Specifically breaking out here, MT1s do not result in a physical change to the locality's physical effective flood insurance rate map. It's a determination for a single property, whereas an MT2 does result in an official revision of the effective flood insurance rate map. So those are the important things. MT1s can be a few months in terms of their submission and review, where MT2s can take up to 6 to 12 months in some cases. Again, there's public input for MT2s, there's appeal processes, there's even notification in the local newspaper for the MT2s. The reasons for a LOMAR is there's modified hydrology, modified hydraulics, there's better LIDAR or site-specific surveying, the floodway is modified, you might have a new bridge or culvert, you might have installed the dam or a levee, or there might just be a large enough development to warrant a letter of map revision. And then CLOMAR-Fs and LOMAR-Fs, specifically when I call those out, those are when you place fill on a site to elevate structures or buildings above and outside of the special flood hazard area. The general rule is here is once you elevate a site with fill, you do not re-excavate for basements. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with designers and developers where they want to place the fill to build the building above the base flood elevation plus 18 inches, but then they want to come back through and excavate it for its development purpose. One final thing about letters of map change are specifically the community acknowledgement forms that are required. This is the one process during this where the community must sign off on the application that a developer is submitting, unless it's a community application. but it's through a community acknowledgement form. So this is where the local floodplain manager or official actually has to confirm that all local minimum requirements are met for that development in relation to any sort of letter or map change. The general rule here is, as floodplain managers, don't just sign the application, make sure you review it thoroughly, all of the approved permits for the site thoroughly, and then even do a comment sheet, attach a sheet to it that says it meets X, Y, and Z and why it meets X, Y, and Z. And don't be afraid to not sign it. If you do not concur, don't sign the community acknowledgement form. And then finally, I have a host of resources here. These are my Josh's pro tips for floodplain management, letters of map change. These are the variety of resources that exist. I will say calling the FEMA map exchange is extremely informative. And my general rule is if you call and you get someone that doesn't really know the answer, call back, because you will get someone that really knows the ins and outs of letters of map change if you are struggling. You also can reach out to Bill Bradfield, our NFIP program manager here for the state of Pennsylvania. Some of my other pro tips are FEMA technical bulletins. Remember again the disclaimer, these are advisory and these are guidance. These are not your locally adopted regulations. The ones in bold being my favorites to use for one permit. There's also a variety of other guides related to flood insurance, substantial improvement and dry flood proofing. The substantial improvement one and the dry flood proofing one are lengthy. There are hundreds of pages, but they are extremely informative if you're dealing with substantial improvement problems or dry flood proofing. Every year that the building codes are updated, FEMA releases a really good PDF online. So in Pennsylvania, we currently use the 2009 I-codes. So you can just Google or click the link here to find those code revisions where FEMA pulls out all of the codes in the I-codes and puts it in one really nicely packaged PDF resource. There's also an amazing code master. This is a laminated pamphlet that you can buy that sits on your desk if you're reviewing plans in the floodplain. And they also release this every time the I-codes are updated. Some of my other best tips are these resources: the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines from the Waterfront Alliance, which promotes resilience, ecology, and access to waterways. Really much like LEED certification, it's a point system where you can get certain points that go towards resiliency, ecology, and access. After Hurricane Sandy, New York City developed amazing design and planning guidelines for its open spaces, its parks, its trails, its greenways. So I really recommend this in terms of those types of spaces in floodplains. And then PennDOT is doing amazing work dealing with vulnerabilities, specifically flooding and landslides through some of their reporting as well. It's also important that when PennDOT comes into your jurisdiction and is doing a bridge project, making sure that they're meeting all the NFIP requirements, because their new bridge design could cause more velocity, it could cause more backwaters. So making sure that they're doing all of the minimum FEMA requirements, whether it's letters of map change, et cetera. There's also a lot of resources from the state. There's the state floodplain management insurance page, as well as the annual report. So if you're a floodplain manager, every year the state does require you to submit an annual report. And there are consequences if you don't submit that annual report. That reports everything from how many building permits you've issued that year, and if you've changed any of your regulations that year. So it's a mandatory report. And I have a link to that on this slide. There's also a lot of training. Train PA in the PA Construction Codes Academy provides a lot of training in terms of floodplain management. And then there's also specifically targeted training through the National Floodplain Manager Association, the ASFPM, and then locally through PAFPM, which I'm the vice chair of that organization. And we have a few of our board members on the call today. Specifically, PAFPM is offering a floodplain training symposium in March 16th and 17th. So please go to our website for more information. We also provide a bunch of webinars. So on October 22nd at noon, we're offering a really great webinar about modeling in terms of floodplain management and stormwater management. And since my first slide started with Philadelphia, where I currently reside, I'm going to end the presentation today with the city of Pittsburgh. And please, if you have any questions or comments, type those in the chat box or raise your hand and we'll call on you. And again, this will be recorded and posted on SPC's Water Resource Center. We'd like to thank SPC again and the Water Resource Center for helping coordinate this training today, as well as on pafpm.org. Okay, let's go to the questions. Okay, so Beth asked, are the maps updated to include new flood locations when there are reports payout for flooding? Hi, Beth. The maps are not updated when there are payouts. If you're referring to that red dot map, those red dots represent payouts through the National Flood Insurance Program, but it's fairly infrequent for FEMA to map those as special flood hazard areas, even after multiple payouts. Okay, and Annie, love your comment. Please don't have nightmares about elevators and floods now. Hopefully they all are designed with those float switches as well as programmed to rest on the floor above. Great. Okay. Does anyone want to raise their hand or have any questions? I don't see anyone with their hands raised. I know it was a lot of information. This is a training course that takes 4 days in some FEMA cases, but it's a really good 1 hour kind of get you started on floodplain management. Any other questions before we wrap up today's call? Okay, well, hearing none, thanks again for attending today's Floodplain Management 101. And again, we thank the Water Resource Center of SPC, as well as PAFPM. And if you're really interested in getting the information under the resources tab of PAFPM, there's a copy or a little bit older version of this presentation, but it will be going up on SPC's website. Great, awesome, thanks. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and happy Monday.